The frozen cabin, it was supposed to be a fun winter trip. 5 friends, Jake, Emily, Sarah, Mark, and Tom, had planned it for months. They wanted to escape the city, enjoy the snow, and relax in a cozy cabin deep in the woods. The rental listing showed beautiful pictures: a wooden cabin with a stone fireplace, soft beds, and a kitchen stocked with food. The place was far from town, surrounded by a thick forest. It seemed perfect. The drive to the cabin took hours. Snow covered the roads, making it hard to drive. Mark, who was behind the wheel, gripped the steering wheel tightly. "I hope this place is worth it," he muttered. "Relax," Emily said, checking the map on her phone. "We're almost there." When they finally arrived, the cabin looked exactly like the pictures. The roof was covered in snow, and smoke curled from the chimney. It felt warm and inviting. "This is amazing," Sarah exclaimed as she stepped inside. The fireplace crackled, filling the room with warmth. The kitchen was stocked, just as promised. There were thick blankets on the beds, and plenty of firewood stacked near the door. "Let's make some hot chocolate," Emily suggested, setting her bags down. The group settled in, laughing and talking as they unpacked. They played music, cooked dinner, and enjoyed the warmth of the fireplace. Outside, the wind howled through the trees, but inside, everything felt safe and comfortable. As night fell, things started to feel different. It began with footsteps. Tom was the first to notice. He was sitting by the window, sipping his hot chocolate, when he heard it, crunching sounds in the snow. At first, he thought it was just the wind or maybe an animal. But the sound was steady, like someone walking just outside the cabin. "Did you hear that?" he asked, turning to the others. "Hear what?" Jake said, stretching his legs on the couch. Tom hesitated. "I thought I heard footsteps outside." Mark laughed. "Probably just a deer or something." Tom shrugged, but something felt off. He got up and peeked out the window. The moon cast a pale glow over the snow, and everything looked still. No footprints, no movement, just the quiet, empty forest. Shaking his head, he sat back down, telling himself it was nothing. But then came the whispering. Late at night, Emily woke up. She wasn't sure why at first. The cabin was silent except for the crackling fire. But then she heard it, a soft voice, whispering outside the window. She couldn't make out the words, but it sent a chill down her spine. She sat up and looked around. Everyone else was asleep. Carefully, she got out of bed and walked to the window. Peering out, she saw nothing but trees and snow. The whispering had stopped. She took a deep breath and climbed back into bed, pulling the blanket over her head. Maybe she had imagined it. Maybe she was just tired. But the next morning, something was wrong. Jake was missing. His bed was empty, the blankets pushed aside. His boots were gone. The door to the cabin was slightly open, letting in cold air. "Jake?" Mark called, stepping outside. His voice echoed through the quiet woods. There were footprints leading away from the cabin, disappearing into the trees. "Maybe he went for a walk," Sarah suggested, though she didn't sound convinced. "In the middle of the night? Without telling anyone?" Tom shook his head. "That's not like him." They searched the cabin and the area around it, calling Jake's name. There was no answer. As the hours passed, their worry grew. It was freezing outside, and Jake didn't have much with him. Something wasn't right. That night, they locked the doors and windows, huddling close to the fireplace. No one wanted to be alone. Then, They heard the footsteps again. This time, everyone heard it. Slow, crunching steps circling the cabin. Tom grabbed a flashlight and shone it out the window. Nothing. The snow outside was untouched. "That's impossible," Emily whispered. We all heard it. Then, a loud thud came from the roof, like something heavy landing on it. Sarah screamed. Mark grabbed the fireplace poker, his hands shaking. They waited, listening, but the sound didn't come again. Morning came, and Jake was still missing. But something else had changed. The footprints leading into the woods were gone, as if the snow had swallowed them overnight. Emily was shaking as she spoke. "We need to leave. Now." They packed their bags in record time, but when they reached the car, the tires were slashed. Panic set in. They were stranded. "We'll have to walk to town," Mark said, gripping his coat tightly. "No," Tom said suddenly. His face was pale. I think it's the cabin." "What are you talking about?" Sarah asked. Tom took a shaky breath. "I looked up this place before we came. There was a story about the first owner. They said he went crazy, got lost in a snowstorm, and froze to death. But before he died, he swore that no one would take his home from him." Emily's eyes widened. "You think his ghost is still here?" "I don't know," Tom admitted. "But something is keeping us here." That night, one by one, they disappeared. First, Mark. He went outside to get more firewood and never came back. They searched for him, but it was as if he had vanished into thin air. Then Sarah. She was too scared to sleep, so she stayed by the fire. But when Tom and Emily woke up, her chair was empty. The door was open again. It was just the two of them now. Emily grabbed Tom's hand. "We have to leave, even if we have to walk through the snow." They bundled up in every layer they could find and stepped outside. The cold hit them instantly, freezing their breath in the air. They trudged through the deep snow, trying to find the road. Then, they heard it, footsteps behind them. They turned, but no one was there. A whisper floated through the trees. "Stay," Emily screamed, grabbing Tom's arm. "Run!" They ran as fast as they could, stumbling through the snow, their breath coming in gasps. The whispering grew louder, turning into a wailing scream. The wind howled, and the snow seemed to pull at their feet, slowing them down. Then, Tom tripped. He hit the ground hard, struggling to get up. Emily turned to help him, but froze in horror. A shadow stood behind him, tall and thin, with empty, hollow eyes. Its face was covered in frost, its mouth twisted in a silent scream. Tom barely had time to react before the shadow reached for him. He vanished in an instant, swallowed by the snow. Emily ran. She didn't look back. She didn't stop until she saw lights in the distance. The town. She collapsed at the edge of the road, gasping for breath, tears freezing on her face. When she finally found help and told her story, no one believed her. A search party went to the cabin, but they found nothing. No footprints, no bodies, no signs of struggle. The cabin was empty, just as if no one had ever been there. But Emily knew the truth. The cabin was never empty, and it never would be. Icy road nightmare Tom Walker was used to long drives and dangerous roads. As a truck driver, he had spent years traveling through snow, ice, and storms, hauling goods across the country. He wasn't scared easily. But something about this road felt different. It was a lonely stretch of highway deep in the north, covered in ice and surrounded by endless forests. The kind of place where help was far away if anything went wrong. It had started as an ordinary trip. Tom had picked up a load from a warehouse and was heading toward a small town up north. The weather forecast had mentioned snow, but that was normal for this time of year. He had stocked up on coffee, snacks, and extra fuel. He was prepared for a long, cold drive. As he drove, the snow started falling heavier than expected. Soon, the wind picked up, howling through the trees, shaking the truck as it pushed against him. His headlights barely cut through the thick snowfall, making it hard to see more than a few feet ahead. Then, his radio crackled to life. A voice, low and distorted, spoke through the static. "Don't stop. Keep driving." Tom frowned. He reached for the radio. "Who is this?" No answer. Just more static. Probably some prank, he thought. Truckers often played jokes on each other, especially over the radio. He ignored it and kept driving. The snowstorm was getting worse, and the road was becoming slick with ice. His hands tightened on the wheel. A few miles later, the wind roared louder, shaking the truck harder. It was getting too dangerous. He needed to pull over and wait for the storm to pass. He carefully slowed down, searching for a safe spot. Then, the radio crackled again. "Don't stop. Keep driving." This time, the voice was more urgent, almost desperate. Tom's stomach tightened. It wasn't funny anymore. He looked around, but all he could see was snow and darkness. No other cars. No houses. Nothing. Just the endless, frozen wilderness. He pulled over anyway. The moment he did, he felt an eerie silence settle over everything. The storm still raged, but inside his truck, it felt too quiet. He turned off the engine, exhaled, and rubbed his hands together for warmth. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw something. In his side mirror, shadowy figures stood in the snow. His breath caught in his throat. He turned his head quickly, but when he looked directly, there was nothing there. Just snowflakes swirling in the wind. He shook his head. "Get a grip, Tom. You're just tired." But then he glanced at the rearview mirror. They were there. Dark shapes, standing motionless in the snow. Their faces were pale, their eyes hollow, empty sockets staring straight at him. His pulse pounded. He threw the truck into gear and hit the gas, wheels spinning for a moment before catching traction. The figures didn't move, but as he sped away, more of them appeared on the roadside, standing in the deep snow, watching him pass. They were getting closer. His hands were shaking now. He gritted his teeth, forcing himself to focus on the road. The snowstorm made it nearly impossible to see, but stopping wasn't an option anymore. Then, the radio crackled one more time. Too late. Tom's heart felt like it stopped. A shadow loomed in front of his truck. He barely had time to react. He swerved hard to the right, trying to avoid whatever it was. The truck skidded on the ice, tires screeching. For a terrifying moment, he lost control. The truck spun sideways, sliding across the road before slamming into a snowbank. Silence. Tom's head throbbed. His hands were clenched around the wheel. He blinked, trying to catch his breath. Then he looked outside. The figures were everywhere now, surrounding his truck, just standing, watching. A chill ran through his bones, and it had nothing to do with the cold. His radio crackled one last time. "Join us." Tom felt something move behind him, a whisper of breath on his neck. And then, darkness. The next morning, Another truck driver found Tom's truck abandoned on the roadside. The driver's door was open. The footprints in the snow led away from the vehicle. They trailed into the trees, but they never came back. The snowman that moved it was the first snowfall of the year, and Lily was excited. She loved winter, especially building snowmen. As soon as she woke up and saw the thick, white snow covering the ground, she ran outside to play. Her parents had already dressed her in a warm coat, gloves, and boots, and she was ready for fun. Lily worked hard, rolling big snowballs to build a snowman. She made 3 layers, a big one for the bottom, a medium one for the middle, and a small one for the head. Then, she found some stones for the eyes, a carrot for the nose, and small twigs for the arms. Finally, she gave it her old scarf and a hat she found in the closet. "Perfect," she said, stepping back to admire her work. She felt proud. The snowman stood tall, looking cheerful with its carrot nose and warm scarf. That evening, Lily sat by the window, watching her snowman as the wind blew softly outside. It made her happy to see it standing there, just where she had built it. Soon, she grew sleepy, and her mom tucked her into bed. The next morning, when Lily woke up, she ran to the window to check on her snowman. But something was strange. It wasn't in the same spot. It looked like it had moved a little closer to the house. Lily frowned. "That's weird," she mumbled. Maybe she had just imagined it. Maybe the wind had shifted it slightly. Still, it seemed odd. At breakfast, she told her parents, "I think my snowman moved." Her dad chuckled. "Maybe you forgot where you built it." Her mom smiled. "Or maybe someone played a little trick on you." Lily shook her head. "No, I remember exactly where it was. It's closer to the house now." Her parents didn't seem worried, so Lily tried to ignore it. But all day, she kept looking outside, checking to see if anything else changed. That night, she peeked out her window before bed. The snowman was still there. She sighed with relief and curled up under her blankets. But the next morning, when she looked again, her heart skipped a beat. The snowman was even closer. Now, it stood right at the edge of the front yard, only a few steps from the porch. Lily ran downstairs. "Mom, Dad." It moved again. Her dad sighed. "Lily, snowmen don't move. Maybe someone is moving it," her mom suggested. "A neighbor? A friend?" Lily shook her head. No one would do that. It was fine last night. Her parents still weren't convinced. But Lily knew she hadn't imagined it. Something was happening. That night, she decided to watch the snowman closely. She left her curtains open and kept a flashlight by her bed. She fought sleep as long as she could, staring out at the dark yard. At some point, her eyes grew heavy, and she dozed off. Then, a sound woke her, a soft, crunching noise, like footsteps in the snow. She sat up quickly and grabbed her flashlight. Her heart pounded as she aimed the beam out the window. The snowman had moved again. It was standing right in front of the porch now, almost at the steps. Lily gasped and pulled her blankets up to her chin. She wanted to wake her parents, but she was too scared to move. She squeezed her eyes shut and told herself it was a dream. Maybe she was imagining it. Morning came, and she forced herself to look again. The snowman was still there, exactly where she had seen it in the night, right at the porch. Lily ran to her parents' room. It moved again. "I saw it this time." Her dad groaned. "Lily, please. It's just snow. Maybe it melted a little, or the wind shifted it." Her mom frowned. Are you sure you weren't dreaming? I wasn't dreaming. It moved. I heard it in the snow. But no matter how much she insisted, her parents wouldn't believe her. So that night, Lily made a plan. She grabbed an old notebook and wrote down, "Snowman standing at porch, 10 o'clock." Then she set an alarm for midnight. When her alarm beeped, she sat up and looked outside. Her breath caught in her throat. The snowman was on the porch. It was right outside the front door. Lily felt frozen in place. She stared, unable to look away. The snowman was just standing there, like before. But this time, she noticed something different. The scarf she had given it was gone. Lily's hands shook as she wrote in her notebook. Moved again. Now on porch. Scarf missing. She didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The next morning, when she went outside, the snowman was still at the door. And there, in the snow, was her scarf, lying on the ground, as if someone had dropped it. Lily didn't know what to do. She thought about knocking it down, but something about the whole thing scared her too much. That night, she locked her window and pulled the covers over her head. She didn't want to look, but then she heard something. A whisper, a soft, cold voice that sent chills down her spine. Come play with me. Lily's eyes went wide. She held her breath, afraid to move. She told herself she was imagining things, that she was just tired. But the voice came again, this time right outside her window. Come play with me. Lily clamped her hands over her ears and squeezed her eyes shut. She didn't sleep all night. The next morning, when she woke up, her room was freezing. She could see her breath in the air, and the snowman was gone. Lily hesitated before getting out of bed. Slowly, she walked to the window. That's when she saw the writing on the wall. Frosty, icy letters were scrawled across her bedroom wall, glittering in the cold light. Come play with me. Lily screamed. Her parents ran in, their faces full of worry. Lily, what's wrong? She pointed at the wall, her hands shaking. The snowman. It was here. It wrote that. But when her parents looked, the words had already begun to fade, melting like frost on a window. There was no proof, no footprints, no sign of the snowman. Her parents hugged her, telling her it must have been a bad dream. But Lily knew the truth. The snowman had been real, and it wanted her to play. The cry in the blizzard, the wind howled outside, rattling the wooden walls of the small cabin. Snow piled up against the windows, covering the world in white. Inside, Sarah sat near the fireplace, a thick blanket wrapped around her shoulders. The storm had come quickly, and she knew she would be snowed in for days. She had enough firewood and food to last, but the thought of being alone in such harsh weather made her uneasy. Sarah had moved to the mountains a year ago, hoping for peace and solitude. She had grown tired of city life, the noise, the constant rush. Here, in her little cabin, she found quiet. But sometimes, the quiet was too much. As she sipped her tea, she suddenly heard a sound outside. At first, she thought it was the wind, but then she heard it again, a faint, high-pitched cry. She froze, listening closely. It sounded like a baby. Her heart pounded. A baby? Out here? That was impossible. No one lived nearby, and the nearest town was miles away. The storm was too strong for anyone to be outside, let alone a child. She stood up, her hands trembling. The crying continued, coming from just beyond her front door. She hesitated. It could be an animal, but something about the sound felt too real. too human. Taking a deep breath, she grabbed her heavy coat and boots. She knew it was dangerous to go outside in the storm, but she couldn't ignore the cries. If there was even a small chance that a child was out there, she had to help. As she opened the door, the freezing wind hit her like a slap. Snow swirled around her, making it hard to see. The crying was louder now, coming from the trees at the edge of her property. She stepped forward, her boots sinking deep into the snow. "Hello," she called out, her voice barely carrying over the wind. "Is someone there?" No answer, just the crying, pulling her forward. She moved carefully, shielding her face from the icy air. Her breath came in short gasps. The snow was deep, making each step difficult. The cries grew more desperate, leading her deeper into the woods. Then, suddenly, the sound stopped. Sarah froze, her heart hammering. The silence was deafening. She looked around, her eyes adjusting to the darkness. Snow-covered trees surrounded her, their branches weighed down by ice. She turned back the way she came, but something made her stop. Footprints, small ones barely visible in the snow. They led ahead, but then they just ended, as if whoever made them had vanished into thin air. A chill ran down her spine. She turned to head back to the cabin, but her stomach dropped. Figures, shadowy shapes standing in the storm, barely visible through the blowing snow. They were watching her. Panic surged through her. She didn't wait to see who or what they were. She ran. Her legs burned as she pushed through the heavy snow. The wind roared around her, and she could barely see her cabin in the distance. She stumbled, falling hard into the snow, but she forced herself up and kept running. When she reached the cabin, she threw herself inside and slammed the door shut, locking it quickly. She pressed her back against the door, gasping for air. Her hands shook as she reached for the fireplace poker, gripping it tightly. Silence. Nothing but the storm outside. Maybe she imagined it. Maybe the storm had played tricks on her eyes. And then, the crying started again. But this time, it wasn't outside. It was right outside her window. Sarah turned slowly, her breath catching in her throat. The window was covered in frost, the glass fogged over. But through it, she saw movement, a shadow shifting just beyond the glass. Then, the crying changed. It became laughter, a soft, eerie giggle that sent shivers down her spine. She stumbled backward, gripping the fireplace poker like a lifeline. The laughter grew louder, as if whatever was outside knew she was afraid. Then, without warning, the lights flickered and went out. Darkness swallowed the cabin. The only light came from the dying fire in the hearth. Sarah's breaths were shaky, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst. Something moved in the room with her. She heard the floorboards creak, the soft sound of footsteps. Her grip on the poker tightened. "Who's there?" she whispered. No answer, only silence. Then, a whisper, right next to her ear. "You brought me home." Sarah screamed. She swung the poker wildly, hitting nothing but air. She stumbled back toward the fireplace, the dim light casting long, flickering shadows across the room. The laughter returned, echoing from all around her. It was inside. Tears burned in her eyes. She had to get out. She had to run. But where? The storm was too strong, and she didn't know what was waiting for her outside. Then, the laughter stopped. The cabin fell silent once more. Sarah stood frozen, barely daring to breathe. And then, A knock, slow, deliberate, right at her door. She clapped a hand over her mouth, stifling a sob. The knock came again and again. Then the door handle rattled. Sarah backed away. She had locked it. She was sure of it. But the handle twisted, the door creaking as if something was trying to get inside. She grabbed a chair and wedged it under the handle, her hands trembling. Then she ran to her bedroom, slamming the door behind her. She pressed her back against it, tears streaming down her face. The wind howled outside. The storm raged on. But inside, it was eerily still. She didn't sleep. She sat curled in the corner of the room, clutching the fireplace poker, waiting for morning. When the first light of dawn crept through the frosted windows, she finally dared to move. Slowly, she crept toward the front door, her heart hammering. She reached for the chair, hesitating before removing it. The door was still locked. With shaking hands, she turned the latch and pulled it open. Nothing, just snow, piled high against the cabin. The storm had passed. The forest was silent. She stepped outside cautiously. The wind had erased all footprints, as if no one had ever been there. But as she turned back to go inside, she noticed something. A single handprint on the window, small, like that of a child. And in the snow, just beneath it, 2 words had been written with a finger. Thank you. The frozen passenger. It was a freezing night, the kind where the wind bites at your skin, and the road stretches on forever, empty and silent. Mark had been driving for hours, his hands gripping the wheel as he focused on the dark road ahead. His car heater struggled against the icy air, and the snowflakes swirled outside like tiny ghosts. He had been on this road before, but something about tonight felt different. Maybe it was the way the trees stood so still, their bare branches reaching out like fingers. Maybe it was the way the snow-covered ground seemed untouched, as if no one had traveled this way in a long time. As he drove, his headlights cut through the darkness, and that's when he saw her. A woman stood on the side of the road, wrapped in a thin, old-fashioned coat. She looked cold, freezing, even, but she didn't wave or move. She simply stood there, staring into the distance. Mark hesitated. He had always been told not to pick up strangers, especially at night. But something about her seemed off. She looked lost, like she didn't belong there. He slowed down, his tires crunching against the icy road. As he pulled up beside her, he rolled down his window slightly. "Do you need a ride?" he called out. The woman turned her head slowly and nodded. Her movements were stiff, and up close, she looked even colder than before. Her lips were pale, almost blue, and her dark eyes seemed empty, as if she had been walking for a long time without rest. Mark unlocked the door, and she got in without a word. She sat in the passenger seat, hands folded in her lap, her breath barely visible in the cold air. "Where are you headed?" he asked, glancing at her. She whispered an address, her voice so soft he almost didn't hear it. It was in a small town not too far away, but one he didn't recognize. Trying to ease the silence, he asked, "What were you doing out there alone?" The woman didn't answer right away. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Trying to get home." Mark felt a chill run down his spine, and it wasn't from the cold. There was something strange about her presence. Her clothes looked old, like they belonged to another time. The way she spoke, the way she barely moved, it made him uneasy. But he kept driving. The road stretched on, winding through the dark forest. The only sound was the hum of the engine and the occasional gust of wind. Mark glanced at her again, noticing how still she was. She didn't fidget, didn't seem to breathe much. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice quieter now. She turned her head slightly, her dark eyes meeting his. "It's so cold," she whispered. Mark reached to turn up the heater, but the moment he did, the car seemed to grow colder instead. He shivered and gripped the wheel tighter. The drive felt longer than it should have. The road, though familiar, seemed endless. Time stretched, and the deeper they drove into the night, the more uneasy he felt. Finally, the address appeared on the GPS. It led to an old house at the end of a long driveway. The place looked abandoned, with snow piled high on the roof and no lights inside. "This is it?" Mark asked, slowing the car. The woman nodded, but didn't move to get out. "Are you sure?" he asked again, feeling a deep sense of unease. She turned to him and whispered, "Thank you." Then, before his eyes, she vanished. One moment, she was there. The next, the seat was empty. Mark's heart pounded. His breath came fast. He turned in his seat, looking around wildly. There was no way she could have gotten out. He hadn't even heard the door open. A deep fear settled in his chest. He didn't want to be here anymore. He needed answers. He stepped out of the car, his boots crunching in the snow. The cold hit him like a wall, but he pushed forward, heading toward the house. His hand trembled as he knocked on the old wooden door. A few seconds passed before it creaked open, revealing an elderly woman wrapped in a shawl. Her eyes, tired and set, looked up at him. "Can I help you?" she asked. Mark swallowed, his throat dry. "I just gave a woman a ride here. She disappeared. I don't understand." The old woman's face changed, a look of sorrow passing over it. She sighed, stepping back. "Come inside." Mark hesitated, but followed. The house was cold, filled with old furniture and the scent of dust. A fireplace stood in the corner, long dead, and a single candle flickered on a table. The woman sat down, motioning for him to do the same. "Tell me what happened," she said softly. Mark explained everything. The woman on the road, her quiet whispers, the way she disappeared. The old woman nodded, as if she had heard it all before. "That was my daughter," she said finally. Mark's breath caught. "But how?" "She couldn't have. She died," the woman said, her voice heavy. "Many years ago, during a terrible snowstorm. She was trying to find her way home, but she never made it." A cold dread settled over Mark. He didn't want to believe it, but deep down, he knew it was true. The strange way she acted, the chill that filled the car, it all made sense now. The old woman looked at him with sadness. Every winter, she tries again. She stands on that road, waiting for someone to bring her home. Mark's hands were ice cold. He didn't know what to say. Slowly, he stood up, his mind spinning. He needed to leave, needed to process what had just happened. As he reached the door, something made him turn back. The old woman was watching him, her expression unreadable. "She just wants to come home," she whispered. Mark nodded slowly, stepping outside. The night was colder now, the wind sharper. As he reached his car, he felt something, a presence. He turned, looking at the frosted window. There, in the reflection, was her face. She was still waiting for a ride.